Hello and welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I'm Deepak, your host from India, bringing you insights from global business leaders, academicians, and research scholars. Today, we have the privilege of welcoming Dr. Peter Krapp as our distinguished guest on the podcast. Dr. Peter is a professor of film and media studies at the University of California, Irvine, where he is also affiliated with the Department of English and Music in the Clay Trevon School of the Arts. Born in Switzerland, Dr. Krapp studies in Bonn University with the support from the Adenauer Foundation, earned an MPhil from Sterling University, funded by the dad, and completed doctoral work at Constant University. Dr. Peter received his PhD from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Before joining UC Irvine in 2004, Professor Peter taught in the departments of Cultural Studies and Comparative Literature and English at the University of Minnesota and at Bard College, where he also taught courses at the Eastern Maximum Security Prison in upstate New York. A lifelong enthusiast of digital culture, Dr. Peter acquired his first computer, an Apple Macintosh SC, in 1987, and his first laptop, a used PowerBook 140, in 1992. Before his academic career, he worked variously as a musician, journalist, gold courier, web designer, translator, and stockbroker, experiences that shaped his eclectic intellectual outlook. His early websites from the 1990s won awards and were featured in Art Forum and Newsweek for pioneering work on hacktivism and media art. His personal site has been continuously online for over 27 years and remains a testament to his enduring engagement with the digital culture. In today's episode, Dr. Peter Krapp explores key insights from his acclaimed book, Computing Legacies, Digital Cultures of Simulation. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Krapp to the conversation. Dr. Peter, we are deeply honored by your presence and grateful for your time with us today.
It's a great pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor, the book revisits pre-internet systems like CompuServe, Minitel, and Cyclades as alternate networking histories. How do these lost features change the way we understand today's internet and its supposed invalidity?
That's a very good question. And it grows out of my concern after more than 2 decades of teaching, where I am moving further away in age from the typical audience that I talk to, not today, but in front of my class. And they have all grown up taking the internet and the web and mobile devices for granted. So they spend probably more time with those things than I can. So what I can teach is a longer history that allows them to unpack what past choices, what decisions have gone into the technology, the politics, the social dynamics of what to them can seem like it's part of the air, and they take it for granted on the one hand, but they also may not reflect on how it could have been quite different. So it's a sort of a counterfactual approach to the history of media that I sometimes try in class, where I ask them to reflect on a digital culture that could have been set up very differently.
Professor, you describe the internet as flawed, dangerous, and ephemeral, and even ask whether it functions as a kind of museum of computing. How does this metaphor help us think differently about platforms, infrastructure, and digital memory today?
I'm going to try to divide that into two topics. On the one hand, yes, I do think that the more we rely on the internet in general and on our devices in particular that are internet connected to recall, retain, store, communicate our individual and collective memories, the more they are also at risk. And I opened the book with a discussion of a UNESCO document that is concerned about the digital legacy of humanity, but this also applies at the national, at the regional, at the institutional, even at the individual level. Immediately before we started talking, I was backing up images that I had taken with my cell phone to this computer. And, so I rely on my mobile device, on my computer, and then on the cloud to archive my personal memories. And we again like to take for granted that all of these things will work. But anyone who's ever used a phone or a computer knows that they will inevitably eventually fail. So the internet is constantly changing technically and otherwise, and our access is modulated by platforms, by interfaces, by where we are and how we move. So this also has implications for what I call digital memory, which is our individual and collective memory of what these devices are and how we use them. And so when I kind of tongue-in-cheek suggest that we might even ask whether the internet can be a museum of computing, it immediately foregrounds the fact that, in fact, we only tend to see and use the most current layer, the most recent, present and recent past. And all the rhetoric about computing, about digital culture tends to be about the near future, or in some cases, the far future perspective. But we don't worry enough, I believe, about the past and the history of that medium, which has a lot of lessons to teach about what these media are, how they came about, how they work, how we could or should use them. And so when I talk about infrastructure, about technology, but also about platforms and interactions, I try to shift the perspective towards that.
Professor, the Munda name and Paul Otlet's strategy documentation anticipated affordances we now associate with the web, cloud computing, and video conferencing. What do these early documentary utopias reveal about the promises and blind spots of contemporary knowledge infrastructures?
I like to focus on the promises because much as I like leaning into the grumpy old man performance in front of my young students, they are very optimistic still, for the most part, about technology and about digital culture. And at the same time, they're shocked when I tell them that the internet is older than I am, that the web is quite a bit older than they are, and that the ideas, the visions, the inspirations for what these things are now, how we use them now, how we think of them now, actually go back quite a bit longer. So Polo Tlé, when I talk about Polo Tlé in the early 20th century, founded the Mundaneum as an institution that would do better than libraries, better than individual workstations in connecting people. And this is done in a pacifist mode under the impression of the First World War, try to bridge linguistic and national and political and cultural gaps between people, between experts especially, so that they can benefit, as we know they do, when they can exchange information and opinions and insights across those kinds of divides. So the Mundaneum is one of the very early, 1920s vision for what could happen for all humans if we had an infrastructure that allows us to store and process and transmit images and texts and sounds in a way that is interlaced, that is interwoven. And the web is one of those inheritors, one of those legacies, one of those current forms. In all of its flaws, the web is also not maybe what it was supposed to become or what it could have become, but it kind of instantiates a similar idea. So now the Mundaneum really feels, smells like a museum. It's over a century old as a place, as a building, as an idea. But we can still, I think, understand the stakes and the choices that we have today going into 2026 about how is it that we store and share and transmit any kind of information.
Professor, in your discussion of net art and computer museums, you highlight tensions between preservation, emulation, and obsolescence. How should cultural institutions curate bond network art that is unstable, interactive, and often short-lived by design?
So that highlights the fact that we have gone in the last few decades fully into the fast forward mode in not just in building technology, but also in the way that we use it. And one interesting example that I came across and talking to my colleagues here in computer science and informatics, since you bring up emulation, is that as long ago as in the late 1960s, there were computers, this is right as the internet is beginning to be actually implemented as a technical solution to incompatibility between computers. But there was also incompatibility between generations of computers. So I came across a study of a top 5 American insurance company that, of course, insurance companies deal with large data sets, actuarial data, customer data, financial data, risk data. And every time that they upgrade their technology, they risk losing access to data because they used to, generate and process those data and store those data on older computers. And the newer generation is not always backwards compatible. So the idea of emulation is something that is explored much more intensely in the 1960s under the impression that a solution is needed to keep data interoperable. And of course, as I said, the internet is another answer to that problem, that sometimes you have data here and data there. You have processing power here, you have processing power there, maybe in different time zones, maybe in different institutions, maybe in different languages. How do we make them interchangeable? How do we make them interact? How do we allow them to stack? So computer museums learn from that. Computer museums are a more recent phenomenon. Learn from that and say, okay, we cannot possibly keep all kinds of computers in running working order, but we can use emulation. We can use strategies from the history of computing to allow us to at least preserve selected items to fight obsolescence. So there seems to be a built-in obsolescence now when we buy a new device. But at the same time, we know that emulation is also useful even for programming that, right? Because when somebody is programming an app, a game, an interface for mobile phones, they don't program that on a mobile phone. They program it on one platform that can emulate the screen sizes and affordances of multiple different mobile devices. So it's a built-in idea that goes all the way back to the foundation of computing, where a computer is by definition something that can emulate or simulate the operations of other machines. It's a universal machine. And so we can lean into that in understanding the history of computing and how we maybe take a perspective on preservation and sometimes net art or computer art or born digital interactions are the best, but the most complicated artifacts of that that make it a test case for the techniques and the ideas that people are developing to allow that kind of continuity, that kind of preservation.
Professor, the book devotes a chapter to technostalgia and 8-bit music, chiptunes, and so-called fake beat. What does the persistence of retro sound and graphics tell us about how digital cultures negotiate progress, memory, and authenticity?
Thank you. That's a great question. That's where I point out that despite the fact that we, of course, love to have a new device and its new capabilities, there are significant cultures and subcultures across the world, from Scandinavia to Asia, from north to south, all across Africa, etc., that are indulging or even focusing on the apparently obsolete, the apparently nostalgic interfaces of older devices, in particular in gaming, but also in a number of music scenes, electronic music, like the ones that you named, 8-bit or chiptunes. They are not just indulging in nostalgia or tech nostalgia, people my age who remember that certain devices sounded, in a particularly limited palette. But this can be productive because it lends a feeling of authenticity. It lends a feeling of historical context to what you're doing with it, whether in gaming or in animation or in music and sound design. And FakeBit is the imitation of those sounds, but not with the original hardware, but with the latest synthesizer or computer synthesis technology, sampling and then editing, etc. So we see quite a bit of that in movies and television shows that try to take us back to the 1980s, to the 1970s, maybe even to the 1960s, although computers in the 1960s did not always have an audio-visual element, or it wasn't as well understood by a broader audience, because at that time, computers are more something for business or for education, but not for home use or general use. So I think the idea that there is a whole culture across different fields of retro sound, of retro graphics, tells us quite a bit about the fact that people, even if they embrace new devices and new solutions, new interfaces, have an appreciation for the authentic historical context that certain things lend visually or acoustically to it, and that they appreciate not that anything goes, anything is possible, but that there are certain limitations that are actually a creative impulse. So, any musician, any artist, any writer will tell you that sometimes it's better to embrace a limitation, to maybe even self-impose a limitation and then work up against that, than to pretend that, any sound, any image, any pixel is good, because that is just less attractive to creative and to audiences.
Dr. Peter, you trace how early game audio emerges from severe technical constraints. Yet, those constraints now fuel a thriving retro and demo scene culture. What can contemporary design and media theory learn from communities that deliberately work within outdated limitations?
I don't know if the limitations are outdated as much as that they are a challenge, right? So if somebody has to put music into a game, but at the time the game does not have a lot of storage space for sound, right? Remember, sound files take up a lot of space, right? That's technically costly. It's expensive. If you want to design an interactive app or a game that has any kind of interesting acoustics, where is that going to come from? So originally, people were literally poking chips to generate sounds that could sound like applause or a roaring audience, or some kind of interaction, or the sound of, oh, this works or this fails, right? Feedback, acoustic feedback. Designers, not just in games but in any kind of interface, want the interface to be as intuitive and rich and immersive as they can. So they use sound and images to give that kind of feedback. And the constraints, ironically, the constraints that were a real technical problem originally have become something that designers now relish, because it's something that they can embrace as a challenge. They can show their chops, they can show their abilities, they can show off. And in terms of media theory, I think the same thing is true. We can see that embracing the technical constraint, even though the computer promises to have new capabilities, the phone, the tablet, the web app, the social scene promises new affordances. At the same time, if you keep it within a certain limit, then people are more focused, right? So you could even say that, even a broadly ambitious project like your podcast isn't addressing every human on Earth, but it's addressing a specific audience, right? And it's trying to figure out what are the limitations within which I am successfully addressing myself to that group of people, right? Not anybody between the age of 0 and 80, but people with an interest in or people with attention to. And that's a much more promising approach. And designers know that and embrace that.
Very insightful. Professor, one chapter unpacks state surveillance and intelligence operations in virtual worlds and online games. What do these incursions into spaces like MMORPGs reveal about the changing relationship between play, security, and civil liberties?
Now, that is one of my favorite chapters, and I'm glad you bring it up. I've been going around, not just in the US, but in many other countries, talking about this after Edward Snowden and two other leaks showed us more about the reality of that. And there are several ideas that go into that. First of all, it's quite obvious that media technology is not just entertainment or business, but it's fundamentally about communication, right? And any communication tool, from the telephone or the radio on, can also be used for all kinds of illegal or nefarious purposes. So inevitably, even in the postal system, we see that there's a state interest on the one hand in protecting people's privacy and their sense of security. On the other hand, protecting that security by protecting people from anybody who might be a criminal or an enemy, etc. Right? So there's been espionage in the postal system. There's been eavesdropping in the telephone, and MMORPGs are fantasy products. They lean into the idea that you can play as anybody. I routinely meet men my age who play as old ladies or as dragons, right? So you are free. You indulge the illusion that you're free from your own age and gender and nationality and so on, and you can role play as anything else. But by definition, the fact that you're interacting with a potentially very large number of other people also pretending means that is still a technology of communication, just like the telephone, just like anything else on the internet. And so it should not have surprised us, or it should not have surprised Ed Snowden, who is a gamer, was a gamer, and still is a gamer, I believe, according to his autobiography, which he calls the autobiography of a gamer, not of a leaker or a security consultant. So what you call incursions into spaces like MMORPGs, the people in charge of securing your country or mine or any other country say, this is our task. And in particular, in the United States, after 9/11, the security agencies were given a very succinct brief, which is never again. Now, if your job is never again should you be surprised by a terrorist attack, then you're going to be as paranoid as you can in every channel as you can. So the changing relationship between play or fantasy or pretend or entertainment on the one hand, and then the security apparatus on the other hand, does raise some very thorny and complicated questions about civil liberties. The interesting thing that I try to unpack in that chapter also is that, of course, our agencies in the United States are not supposed to spy on citizens like me, but they are collaborating with other countries, the so-called Five Eyes, New Zealand, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and the agencies there can spy on me, and then Americans can spy on the Australians and so on. And there's been enough data sharing so that basically anyone who is online in any way, but in particular in those games where we pretend that this is not a space for organization or business or communication, but just a fantasy space of acting out, has been under very systematic surveillance, even to the point where they had to form a task force to disambiguate when you're like, oh, this person is behaving a little strangely. I don't think they're really playing. Oh, actually, they're working for another country. They're a security agent. So they were spying on each other by coincidence. Now, the nature of that kind of espionage or surveillance is that we never really know whether there was a successful action against some nefarious plans. There are some scenarios, there's some potential ideas that I discussed where they say, okay, this is how these games could be used by terror groups to recruit or to organize or to plan or simply to, leave messages every now and then. But I think that idea has been taken up much more in entertainment again. There are games about that. There are television shows about that. There are movies that use that idea than we have ever heard, but we may not have heard, successful security operations that have foiled plots against some targets that were hatched inside games.
Professor, you engage debates around the magic circle of games and the idea that play is a protected, separate space. After Snowden and pervasive data capture, to what extent can online play still be imagined as distinct from everyday social and political life?
It never was, and this is my biggest problem, I believe, with game studies. So I know I'm not supposed to pick fights with all the members of your audience, but this is my biggest problem with game studies in academia in particular, but also with gamers in general. To imagine a magic circle, I think is a wrong-headed idea from the start. Even the children in the playground who have no technology between each other, but are just interacting and will know that no matter how much they might imagine those interactions are distinct from any of their other social interactions. Oh, I'm just playing. Oh, I didn't mean it. I was just acting as, it will carry over. It does carry over. So there is no such separation of play from work or play from life, much as some idealistic literature has been suggesting that. Right? So in the German tradition, we look to Schiller. In the English Anglophone American tradition, we look to certain early 20th century writing about the people who coined the magic circle, about animal ethology and humans at play, and there's some naive idealism, I believe, in the background that says, oh, if only I could be free from the constrictions, the boundaries, the duties of being a brother, a sister, a son, a father, a worker, an employee, an employer, etc. We want to imagine that freedom, and entertainment sells us those kinds of flights of fantasy, escapism. And a lot of business is providing those escapist moments, and we need them, we relish them. That's why we read fiction. That's why we tell stories. That's why we role play. That's why we play music or dance. A lot of cultural forms are allowing us that escape. But we also know that it does feed back, right? And so I don't believe in the magic circle at all. Play is not a protected, separate space. Culture is not really a protected, separate space. Culture is part of everything else, everyday social and political life, and should be understood and analyzed that way, much as we want cultural interactions to be special or to have special qualities. And they can have those, like we can ascribe them to those things, but we also understand that they're always inscribed in economic and social and political realities and return us to them.
Professor, the book repeatedly shows how simulations from management games like virtual EU to military or educational platforms encode specific institutional assumptions. How can players, designers, or scholars make those built-in biases visible and content-stable?
That's immediately the next idea. So you point exactly in that direction. And the question: simulations, scenario games, management games, planning games have been a long-standing tradition in academia, in corporate environments, in politics, in the military. And we could even go back to the whole history of chess and chaturanga and other kind of abstract board or floor games, or even sports in some ways, theater in some ways, that render interactions playable, explorable, and in a mode of what if, right? What if we did it this way? What if we had done it differently? What if, Henry VIII, or what if, and we not to debunk them, not to falsify them, but to explore, right? So management games in particular, like the one that I study at length, because it's it allows you to play as somebody running an institution of higher education, a college or university. But also there's a long tradition that I write about of military scenarios or educational scenarios, management scenarios. It turns out oil companies, multinational oil companies and pharmaceutical companies are very good at using those to train their managers to be better informed, real-time data, very rich data sets. What we know about simulations is that by definition, they're reduced, they're abstract, they're small models, right? And now, if they are really just a small model, they allow us to train, right? So flight simulators started with something very, very simple that looks more like a little model horse, right? And it teaches you feedback. If I do this, I move this way. If I do that, I move this way. If I do this, I fly successfully. If I do that, I crash. It's very expensive to train people on the real thing because planes are destroyed and lives are lost if you do that. So you train on a simulator. Today, we train nurses in simulations. We train managers in simulations. It's much less costly, much less risky. And simulations are often understood as in the business of risk-averse scenario planning, right? That's also, of course, the reason why we have a lot of military simulations. Sometimes we forget that these simulations are not exactly the real thing. They may not have as rich a data set as a real social, economic, military, political situation may require, right? I'm reminded of that every day when I look at my weather app on my phone. And you would think that after centuries of weather forecast technology, using computers now, using very complex dynamics models, algorithmic models of fluid dynamics, we should have more or less accurate weather prediction. But it keeps failing, right? Because when you try to shrink it down to the capabilities of a mobile phone, of a platform, you necessarily omit some complexity. So players can be trained, can explore, can learn, can also explore counterintuitive, counterfactual ideas. Like, what if somebody had acted differently? Can, replay this political decision, this management decision, this military campaign. Designers can say, okay, computers are very good, much better than humans at chaining together. What if, what if, what if, what if, what if, decision trees, lots of complexity built in. And so designers try to show how these systems can scale to a level of complexity. At the same time, any player who understands the game well enough, and a lot of gamers understand their games really well, understand that necessarily some of the decisions that the designer has made are baked in bias, right? So, for example, a game like Civilization, a role-play game that allows you to play different historical leaders, does not take very seriously the role of weather, for example, in Napoleon's incursion into Russia. The Russians might not like to hear this, but I would say that cold weather played a very big role in repelling Napoleon's army, and the Russians cannot take all the credit. Their weather helped. And modeling weather is complicated. Not a lot of military games or scenario games are doing well with complicated factors like that, terrain, succession, right? So when you do a management simulation, an educational platform, you always have to interrogate, okay, what are the assumptions? In Virtual U, the study that I did of Virtual U, of that educational management, it turns out it's a very, very subtle, very intelligent, very well-informed game, informed by decades of experience by the people who programmed it, lots and lots of data, but they never considered, for example, inflation as a role. Now, inflation is a big driver of costs for the institution. It has impacts. They also didn't consider the possibility, even though this is an American game and we know there are student demonstrations, there are protests, they didn't program the possibility of student protests. Now, if you raise tuition, students are likely to protest, et cetera, et cetera. So the more you play the game, the more you learn to play with the game, play with its assumptions, and ferret out certain kinds of assumptions that are baked into the logic, right? Even, a chess master knows, yes, you have to assume that the capabilities of this piece are defined by the rules, but if I'm creative, if I'm really great and talented at it, I can still surprise my opponent by using that in an unpredictable way or in a surprising way, or showing that, they overestimated or underestimated the power of a particular piece or particular move. Right? So scholars are looking at how players and designers have agreements and disagreements on certain kinds of affordances that are part and parcel of taking a very complicated situation and trying to put it into a box, whether that box is on my table or in my computer.
Dr. Peter, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. Across discussions of museum, gaming cultures, surveillance, and higher education, you argue that simulations help manufacture certain computing legacies while obscuring others. If you had to name one legacy we urgently need to recover or rethink, what would it be and why now?
That's a very difficult to answer question, at least difficult to answer succinctly, but it's very perceptive because that is, in fact, the overall aim of the book. The reason it's called Computing Legacies and not Computing Cultures or Digital Feedback is that I think across all of these case studies of how simulation functions in digital culture, we probably should recover or rethink the idea that this is not simply a linear, progressive, future-oriented discourse, but that there are sort of certain loops that return us either in technostalgia or in preservation or in emulation or in a very technical basis of how computers work to previous states, to previous technical questions and technical answers to those questions. So when I talk about simulation as a scenario planning discipline, it tends to be about risk avoidance, it tends to be future oriented, but the very same technology from the birth of the digital computer on is also one that allows us to be backwards compatible, that allows us to access yesterday's data, that allows us to store, commemorate, repeat, recover older information, or recombine older information with new questions, with new ideas, new perspectives. So my next project will definitely pick up where I left off there in terms of museums. As I said briefly before, computer museums are kind of a recent phenomenon. I don't know how many there are in India or anywhere else, but they have been popping up everywhere around the planet kind of since the 1990s, since the commercialization of personal computing and mobile computing, and since the popularization of the internet, the commercialization of the internet. A lot of companies around the world, a lot of individuals around the world have begun to realize our story should be told or could be told in certain ways. Our history, our institutional and national and international culture of interacting is something that we could musealize. And museums, of course, use simulation, emulation to preserve and present and explain the story of computing, the story of the internet, the story of digital culture. So I would argue that that's a computing legacy that I'm very interested in, the institutional form of the computer museum. Now, unfortunately, 30 or so years later, I see that a lot of museums are closing their doors already because they have run into material limitations of keeping computers running, explaining computers, preserving computers, repairing computers. And I have the expectation that simulation or emulation or online museums are one answer to that, but it's not a wholly satisfying answer to that. So our cultural legacy, our computing legacy is at risk, not just of being broken or forgotten, but also misunderstood, misrepresented by people who are selling us what they want to sell today. And so I'd like to pursue that further.
Thank you, Professor Peter Krapp, for this insightful conversation and for sharing the rich ideas behind computing legacies, digital cultures of simulation. Your reflections on digital culture, technostalgia, and the histories of networking and simulation will be invaluable to our listeners as they rethink how technology, memory, and power intersect in everyday life. It has been an honor to learn from your work and to explore how these legacies continue to shape the way we design, use, and imagine media today. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for your very perceptive and interesting questions, challenging questions.
Thank you.